So good morning, everyone. Please grab your cup of coffee and a seat, and we'll get started in just a minute here. We had a small technical issue with our Zoom. We think we have a couple of dozen people online watching on Zoom, so we're going to make sure they're tuned in and can watch all of this. Well, again, good morning, and thank you so much for being here. I am Paul Tesks. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at University of Colorado, Denver, where we are both celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So I started in 1972, more or less officially. And the welcome back, by the way, to First Friday regulars from years past before COVID and when we went online, and welcome to newer folks that are with us here today. The theme of the year for our First Fridays is going to be 50 years because of our anniversary, 50 years of this, that, and the other thing. And today we're starting with population because as we thought about it, really, you know, when you think of Colorado as a state over the last 50 years, at least one of the things that stands out in a big way is we've grown a lot. And the state demographer, Elizabeth Garner, will tell us more about the details of that. And we're going to grow more in the future, and growth. You know, I grew up in New York State in the 1970s, and it was actually declining in population. People were moving to the South and jobs. And, you know, I think there's a lot of problems and public policy challenges with growth, but there's probably more challenges with declining population. And so, you know, we want to understand what's happened in 50 years and the changing population and other things, and we have a great panel to help us do that this morning. I have just some few initial comments. First of all, thank you to Tula Wellbrook in the back with SPA, Joan Fishburne, our alumni director and coordinator, Dawn Savage, who's helping us out, and the other SPA staff folks who have helped us this morning. So thank you very much. Also want to thank our caterer, Serendipity Caterer, and our servers. Serendipity is very big on environmental sustainability issues. They're a women-owned small business, and so we're delighted to have their catering this morning. I also want to start with a land acknowledgement, which we do at big events here at CU Denver. This was written by Gracie Redshirt Tyan, a Lakota student at the Auraria Campus. I'll just read it. Acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of the indigenous peoples is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States worked hard to erase the narratives of indigenous people over time. Land acknowledgement statements can help us remind us of that history, the contributions and sacrifices Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Arapaho, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, among others. We must recognize indigenous people are the original stewards of this land as these words of acknowledgements are spoken and heard. Remember that these nations still have their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from the territory and pay our respects to the diverse indigenous people still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to the nations and to the ancestors of this place. So thank you. And also on the 50th anniversary of this school and university, a little bit before that, in the late 1960s, the Auraria Campus was built based on an urban renewal project that tore down viable Hispanic, mostly housing in this area. And we, as a campus, are acknowledging, it was controversial at the time, I think. I wasn't here myself, but it's certainly controversial later. And we're working with some of the 9th Street memorial aspects of that to try to commemorate those issues. So thank you. In terms of today, just logistically, the bathrooms, if you need them, are to the back. The event will run till about 10. If you have to leave earlier, please feel free to do that. I think outside we asked you to maybe get a card and write some questions. If you do have questions, try to have those ready by 9:40 and we'll address them to the panel before we're finished at 10. Yeah, I think that's basically it. So I'm very excited that we have been able to put together this fantastic panel. And the way we're going to organize it is that immediately to my right is Elizabeth Garner, the state demographer. Elizabeth has degrees from the University of San Diego and Colorado State University. She's been the state demographer for quite some time and is a sought after speaker. It was actually at an event yesterday where she talked to the governor's fellows about state demography. I think she needs to run actually today right at 10 because she's got another speech to give down in the tech center and needs to get that on time. But we're really looking forward to her presentation. We have next to her Jason Hanson, the Chief Creative Officer of History Colorado, who I also got to see yesterday over at History Colorado. Jason has undergraduate degree from Pacific Lutheran University and master's degrees from Boulder in American history and from our own School of Architecture and Planning. Jason has a very big picture of Western history and Colorado history, and I'm looking forward to the comments and input that he can provide today. And then on my far right is Gail Klapper. Gail is the head of the Colorado Forum. She's also the managing partner of the Klapper Law Firm. She has undergraduate degree from Wellesley University, law degree from Boulder. And Gail, the Colorado Forum, for those of you that don't know, works civic leaders work very hard on pressing public policy issues. It's been around for about 40 years, and Gail's been the head of it for about 33. Is that right? So we don't quite cover the whole 50-year span, but quite a bit of it. And so the idea here is that Gail and her group has worked on a lot of issues, many of which have been related to population issues. And I actually have to note quickly, many of you in public policy that have been at SPA or elsewhere, you've worked on cases, and the Harvard Kennedy School case is one of the very early ones. In fact, so early it's typed. You can see sort of the typewriter things is about Dick Lamb's growth policies in the early 1980s, and Gail Klapper's mentioned, and the human settlement patterns. It was an attempt to kind of drive growth to certain places and not in others. And so there's a long history here of Gail working on these issues. So with that, we'll have the panelists present some initial thoughts on this topic. I'll ask some questions, and then your questions or questions from Zoom can come in, and we'll wrap up by 10. And I should say too, logistically, we're not kicked out of here at 10. So if there's more food or conversations, I know some of you are having some good networking conversations, please continue those after the panel is over. So with that, I'll offer the floor to Elizabeth. Hopefully we can get that PowerPoint up. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm just going to do this. That way I don't have to figure out how to turn that on. I know I can see it maybe, but I'm just going to do this one. So thanks so much, Paul, and everyone for inviting me to be part of the program today. I'm very excited about it. And it's interesting also thinking 50 years. I will tell you that we don't often go back 50 years necessarily thinking. We definitely go forward, and not quite 50 years. We're only at a 30-year in our forecast. But interesting to see how Denver and how Colorado has changed over that time. So we're going to start at the beginning. And then not really beginning, start at 1900. The blue bars are looking at Colorado absolute change from decade to decade. The orange line is percentage growth rate, right? Because that really matters, kind of the denominator as well as that total growth. And what we can definitely see is that recently, this last decade, between 2010 and 2020, we increased by about 745,000, very similar to what we grew the previous decade, but at a slower growth rate, right? Because the denominator, the base is bigger. Certainly the 90s stick out in terms of the growth that we experienced in the 1990s, definitely the fastest or the largest growth amount. But if we go back, we can also look at the 70s and the growth rate. And I'll bring this up because of architecture and other pieces. The 70s, interestingly, is when Colorado built the largest number of housing units in the state. which if you drive around, you're like, why do we have that architecture? And it's because we built so many housing units, like especially if you drive through like Jeffco, why we have so many bi-levels and tri-levels and kind of funky stucco, all from that groovy 70s decade when we built a bunch of housing units. But interesting to see this change over the decades. In 1970, we were at about 2.2 million people. In 2020, we're at this 5.7 million. So really an increase of 3.5 million people over this last 50 years. And if we look at where all of that change occurred, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue decline. It's interesting to see the patterns of growth really haven't changed that much recent as we look historical, very concentrated along the I-25 corridor with declines really in the Eastern Plains and parts of the San Luis Valley. So very similar and interesting that you brought up Denver. I was going back and looking at this piece. If we look at the change in Denver from 1970 to 2020, it's only an increase, and maybe I have it on this one. Yep. Only an increase of about 200,000 people in Denver, which is, I'm going to try and do this right there. That's the total change was 200,000 in Denver. If we look at that total time frame, Denver actually had a net out migration over that total time. The only increase has been due to natural increase, which is births minus deaths. So if we look at the change in Colorado over that 50-year time frame, it's really driven by two counties. El Paso and Arapahoe are the two counties where we've seen about 500,000 in total population change. Then we've got some other counties, certainly Douglas, Jefferson, Adams are in there, but interesting to see Denver at the bottom, kind of seventh in that group of top 10 growth, because so many people think about, oh, just everybody flocking to Denver. And it's really people flocking to the Front Range, not necessarily just straight Denver. If we look at percentage change, I love to highlight Douglas County. Over that time frame, an increase of over 800%, starting at 8,000 people, now at 360,000 people. So interesting to see that growth specifically in that Douglas County, where it started as such a baby county and now is such a big county in the Denver Front Range area. Likewise, I think Summit County is also interesting to think about. A lot of us have been up in that area, certainly involved with like the ski industry, outdoor rec. Started at 2,700 and is now at that 30,000. And you're thinking to yourself, 30,000 isn't that many, but if you start at 2,000, that is, a pretty significant increase. But interesting to see that there's majority of our counties have had relatively no change over that time frame, over that 70 years, that it's a very concentrated growth in Colorado. Important to know what drives growth. Births, deaths, net migration, pretty easy. Births and deaths come up with this concept called natural increase, represented by the blue. We reached our peak natural increase in 2007, and we're slowing down. Why? Because we're seeing slowing births and increasing deaths, not just COVID deaths, but just increasing deaths because we're getting older. Net migration is represented by the red, and we can kind of see these patterns of booms and busts in our economy. Certainly we can see the out migration in the 80s. Anybody remember the 80s? Anybody? There's a couple of us in here that remember the 80s. We had the oil and gas bust, savings and loan bust. It was not a fun time necessarily to be in Colorado, and especially in Denver Metro. Tough time. Then we got the 90s, but then we can see since 2001, we really have not had any growth over 100,000 in the state. Yet our feeling most of the time is that exponential growth, everybody flocking to Colorado, And I'm here to tell you, no, it has been slowing down, and especially recently, and especially compared to other states, our absolute and our percentage is slowing down. What drives most of our population growth? And this, again, seems to dumbfound a lot of people. It's really job growth. The blue bars are job growth. The red line is net migration. When we have stronger job growth, we tend to have stronger net migration. And a lot of you are thinking to yourself, duh, we need people to fill jobs because we create more jobs than we've got people here to fill. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. What we are forecasting is this kind of bump back in 2025. Remember that this includes all of the jobs we lost in COVID. So it's not like we're expecting exponential growth necessarily in jobs. This 5-year time frame, it's just returning those jobs that we lost and then slowing down out into the future. So what are some of the biggest trends that we're seeing? One is the fact that we're slowing down and that about 25% of our counties declined in population. 2, we're seeing migration slowing down. Colorado is becoming less competitive. 3, we're seeing concentrated growth. And this is another point of discussion, is to see, does that make sense? Are there other alternatives? What could be some policies, or just even understanding why? A lot of it has to be the types of jobs that we're growing. We're aging. I woke up a day older. I'm sure everybody else did. And this is a huge impact, especially when we start thinking about job growth and job replacement. I will be aging out of the labor force, staying in Colorado, but I'll need a new person to fill my job, and she's not living in my house. And that's going to be the same for about 500,000 of us over this decade, aging out of the labor force. We're also becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, which is really important to be thinking about in terms of the growth. Uh-oh, I did something wrong. All right, friends in the back, will you make me go forward? There we go. So one of the biggest things is to see this slowdown in that under 18 population. In the United States, because of that slowing birth rate, all of the blue shaded county states had an absolute decline in their under 18 population. For the US as a whole, 1 million person decline in the under 18. This is going to have long run implications for K-12, higher ed, labor force. You can see Colorado's peach colored, meaning it did have growth, but not as fast as some other states. In Colorado, red, orange, yellow, positive, all of the shades of blue are counties that had an absolute decline in the under 18 population, and there was no region in the state that avoided it. Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, Western Slope, Denver Metro, all counties that had a decline in the under 18 population. Our under 18 population increased by 38,000 this last decade. The last decade, it was 125,000. So a magnitude difference in that increase. This again impacts the high K-12, higher ed, labor force. So I said that we're aging. This is Colorado's age distribution broken down by single year of age, broken down by the different colors or different generations. On that far left-hand side, we can see that slowdown in kiddos. On the far right-hand side, we can see the aging of Colorado. The black line is 65. We can see the number of people aging into the 65 plus, potentially out of the labor force. And we can see the fewer number of people aging in. Will this have a tremendous impact in the state? Absolutely. If we're looking at growth over these decades and different age groups just through 2050, what we're looking at is really the largest amount of growth between 2020 and 2050 in that 65 plus population. Over the next 3 decades, between 2020 and 2050, very little growth in those youngins. That 25 to 44 only growth if we can actually migrate people here, and we can talk about that benefit drawback. The 45 to 64 is pretty good because typically people are already here and they're just having birthdays, they're aging into that age group. But interesting to see that by 2050, we will have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18, which will be the first time really ever. We're also becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. Over this last decade, our fastest growth or the largest growth was really in our people of color. The top part of the bar shows our 18 plus. That lighter blue is our white non-Hispanic, represented about 40% of the total growth in the state. That means that 60% of our growth were people of color. Now, I will also tell you, they redefined race and ethnicity over this last decade, as well as how we also interpret our own race and ethnicity. So can we really say that these were all total changes? No, it could be that we also reclassified ourselves, but that doesn't really matter because it's really how we feel who we are that should be represented in the data. If we look at the under 18 population, an absolute decline in the white non-Hispanic, our only growth were in people of color, resulting in the fact that it's really our youth. It's the people entering higher ed, entering the labor force that are going to be more diverse than the folks that are leaving the labor force and our older population, which leaves a whole slew of opportunities to market and outreach differently than we have historically. Our forecast for the next 30 years, since we don't go out 50, starting at that 5.7 million, hitting starting at 5.7 million, reaching the 7.5 million by 2050. So that's an increase of 1.8 million. I've said that things are slowing down and you're like, but Elizabeth, that's 1.8 million people. Yes, it's more people, but at a much slower growth rate, which we can also talk about to know, are we prepared for managing life at a slower growth rate, since so many of our policies and programs are based on a fast growth rate. All of the shades of blue are counties that were forecasting declines, not that different than what we saw the previous 50 years. And as Paul mentioned, it's hard to manage growth. It's also hard to manage decline. And thinking about this concept of strategic shrinkage should also be in people's planning process. Lots of uncertainties, which I'm not going to touch at all, but just know that there are uncertainties in this forecast. Certainly a list of things that you could touch on if you wanted to ask questions after the panel is done. But with that, I want to make sure that everybody's got our contact information for our office and our very cool website. Please come and visit. Hit us up if you've got any questions or anything like that after this event. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Paul.
As always, that was awesome and very insightful and tees up a lot of questions, I think. But next, I want to give Jason Hanson a few minutes. Yesterday at History Colorado, Jason traced 13,000 years of Colorado history. And so asking him to do 50 is a little different, but just appreciate your thoughts on population growth and change and how it affects what you see in Colorado, Jason.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to get this to work. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, and I imagine the mic is good for the Zoom as well. So first of all, thank you for having me here. Historians dream of getting invited into policy conversations. I dream of like the president having a council of historical advisors like he does a council of economic advisors. And maybe this is one small, tiny step closer to that reality. But I got a chance, because apparently we're traveling the same circuit, to see a version of what Elizabeth presented yesterday. So I've had 24 hours to think about it. And I think, at first I was sort of dismayed because what can I add to that? It was, the numbers are illuminating. And I think what I can add is a little bit of the cultural historical context. And I won't do 13,000 years, but actually this works out well. 50 years, or really more like 70, is a period that historians call the rise of the New West out here. And this is one of the most important stories. Maybe, I mean, you could make an argument, I could make an argument on a good day that this is a more important story in Colorado history than the gold rush. This is a very, very important story, and it's not one that gets told all that often. But in this context, what it is the story of is, if people follow the jobs, and I think we can talk about that, why are the jobs here? What is bringing those jobs to Colorado? They don't just sprout up in a vacuum because people want to make jobs, or do they? And really, the rise of the New West begins right after World War II, and it begins with federal spending. Direct federal spending in Colorado between 1952 and 1962 accounted for 20% of the state's revenue. And that's before you factor in the federally supported projects like constructing I-25, I-70, research dollars flowing to universities. There was massive federal investment. And that massive federal investment had a couple of effects. One, it attracted other industry that wanted to locate near, and you can name these places in your heads, you know, Rocky Flats, Rocky Mountain Arsenal, NREL, NCAR, Pueblo Ordnance Depot. I have a list of them here: the Air Force Academy, NORAD, the expansion of Fort Carson, some of the uranium rush support out around Grand Junction. It's just everywhere there's federal investment, and that federal investment is attracting others who want to be part of that. And those, along with the feds, are creating these jobs that people are coming here for. So think of Lockheed Martin. Why is Lockheed here? Well, it's here because of this massive federal investment in the Cold War military industrial complex, and it is deeply ingrained in that complex. That's just one example. There are aerospace industry in general. I think we can thank the federal government's early Cold War investments for. Even if they didn't directly fund those companies are here because they were working with the researchers, with the scientists, with the federal government in a lot of different ways. So it creates jobs. But that's not what the rise of the New West is. That would just be like a great federal investment story. No, what we mean as historians when we talk about the New West is there's been a shift. And the way I like to say it is the West's natural amenities became more important than the West's natural resources. Colorado's history from the gold rush up until World War II was powered by natural resources, extractive industries, whether those were mining, agriculture, extracting the nutrients from the grasses and turning them into cattle, or extracting nutrients from the soil and turning them into crops, or timber to a limited capacity. It was all natural resource driven. What was here, what this place was lucky enough to have in its mountains, on its plains, was driving the economy. I think we sort of know this intuitively. But starting with World War II, those federal investments, they weren't reliant on those natural resources. They were reliant by and large on the fact that, they were in the sense that the mountains made good places to hide military bases and so forth. But they were also reliant on the fact that we were the middle of the country. We were perceived to be more secure. It was a good place to locate some of your important work in the Cold War. And so a lot of people came here, whether they came to work at Lockheed or one of the research labs, they came here, they were getting good salaries. And this is where the New West really comes in, because what that does is it creates a leisure class, people with money to burn at numbers that Colorado had never seen before. And those people with money to burn were looking for ways to spend their time to enjoy living in this place. And they happened to run into a moment when the outdoor recreation industry was getting started. The 10th Mountain Division troops had returned from World War II, and it's not only them, but I like to focus on them, and it's by and large veterans of the 10th Mountain Division, return. They start the ski resorts we are familiar with here in Colorado and around the country. But more than that, they also make recreational climbing popular. They make camping, backpacking in the backcountry popular. These were things that had been just starting to take off before the war. And the federal government, again, the investment that they made in developing technology that would help the 10th Mountain Division fight in the winter in Italy in the Italian Alps, came back and supercharged that nascent interest from before the war into a full-fledged outdoor recreation economy that today is one of the pillars of Colorado's economy. It also creates teenagers. If we, yes, and I, as the dad of a almost teenager who I let pick my pocket square this morning, I think the best way to define a teenager is basically a fully grown adult without real responsibilities and with money to burn. So there's a class all of a sudden of teenagers who aren't going to work in the mines, on the farms. They are footloose in a way, and they start to support a music scene. You know, they start to purchase records that they like. They start to support all kinds of cultural endeavors. They create an energy, and these culturally start to feed on each other, right? And soon what you have, this is where the New West really takes its own shape. You have people who are moving here not for the jobs, but because they want to be in Colorado. And we all probably know some people in our own lives who did that. But two really prominent examples that we all know are John Denver, born John Duchendorf, who just had passed through the Rockies with his family on some family vacations growing up. And when he decided that he was going to make a go of it as a singer, he started in LA and he realized he really wanted to be in Colorado. He came to Colorado and decided he's going to try and make a career of it. So much so that he changes his name to Denver. He writes Rocky Mountain High. And someone maybe 5 years ago in your office told me that I'm not allowed to say this is causal. But 1971-72, when Rocky Mountain High is at the top of the charts, are, I believe, the highest population growth that we saw it on the chart. Yeah, highest population growth Colorado has seen since the early mineral rushes. And it is not just because there are magically jobs here, it is because people are coming here because they want to be here. And then they are figuring out what are those jobs that we can create, that we can do. The other good example that we all know is an unemployed geologist who really just wanted to live in Colorado. And so decided to start a brew pub not far from here on Wine Coop Street. John Hickenlooper could have gone to find another geologist job in Texas or some other place, but decided he really wanted to stay here. And beer was the job that he could do. It ended up creating more jobs as the wine coop took off, as the industry, the brewing industry here sort of grew exponentially. And then, you know, just to prove that the New West is a lot like the Old West, the saloon owner became the mayor, became the governor, became the senator. So I think we've seen growth has continued and growth has maybe started to plateau and decline statewide, but not in those places that either welcomed and attracted that federal investment or benefited from the growth of that outdoor recreation industry. Those are the places that are the reds and oranges on the map that we just saw. And so I think the questions that I have in thinking about growth and watching Elizabeth's presentation, you know, the long version and the abbreviated one this morning, are twofold. If growth really is slowing down, does that mean we have reached peak New West? The New West as an era here has peaked and is beginning to decline, and some other historical cultural force is starting to guide things here in Colorado. And two, and this is something that I'm just really curious to hear from Elizabeth about, what are the pros and cons of thinking about growth from a statewide perspective versus from a local or regional metro perspective? Because from where I'm sitting, like Arapahoe County and Kiowa County might as well be totally different planets. And, you know, the statewide numbers get dragged down maybe in some other places, but they're certainly not getting dragged down in Arapahoe. And so I'm just very curious in the discussion later, I'm hoping to seed that question in one of you so that we can talk about it. And with that, I will pass it along to Gail. Thank you.
So I'm curious, how many of you know anything about the Colorado Forum? Great. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this organization that's focusing on public policy, and then a little bit about how growth in all its dimensions is something that we have been involved with for the last 40 years, 40 plus years. So the Colorado Forum is a group of CEOs statewide and civic leaders that work on good public policy for Colorado. It is an invitation-only organization. And we ask people who come into the Colorado Forum to leave their pocketbook at the door, to leave their politics at the door, to leave their businesses at the door, and to really focus on what's good for Colorado. And it totally changes the conversation that we have because of those dimensions. In addition, we operate by 100% consensus. So we are a very diverse organization in every dimension, but we learn together and we hear all sides of an issue. And then interestingly, once we understand a particular public policy issue, it is not that hard to get consensus in our group. And we have no term limits. So we have people who have been members of the forum for its entire life. And we have new members and we have a cap on our membership so people can get to know each other. I'm going to let Mark Safdie talk about it because he was a member of the Colorado Forum. I say completely immodestly, it is the most awesome group you can imagine. I mean, these are people you would be so proud to have thinking about what's good for our state. So with regard to the issues that the Colorado Forum gets involved with, they like to find only the most intractable, long tenured, impossible to solve issues. And then they stick with them with the kind of tenacity you would not believe. So these individuals have built businesses. They have run organizations and they know what it takes to change public policy. And so we see that things like the Animas La Plata Water Project in Durango, Denver International Airport, the Denver preschool program, trying to think the cleanup of Rocky Flats. Now, Colorado Forum, we're a little like the Wizard of Oz. We have just a few staff people, and we take pride in those issues having been resolved. But we partner in everything we do with as many people and organizations as we can find who also have a similar interest. So I want to talk a little bit about the growth issue because growth is an interesting word. You can say growth is great and it brings more revenue. We love growth. Or you can say growth is terrible. It brings in drug dealers and drug addicts, and it uses up all our groundwater in places like Douglas County and other places. So I think you can't say, just without defining the growth you're talking about, whether it's a good or a bad thing. But growth has its impact on everything, virtually everything that the Colorado Forum has done. So right now, we are very focused on what we're calling the Healthy Colorado Initiative. And we've partnered with the Nature Conservancy and the Aspen Institute to put this together. And we're trying to figure out how we build and renovate buildings in Colorado. And I should just tell you, we have consortia from Durango, from Grand Junction, from Pueblo. We have members from Northern Colorado, from the Eastern Plains. So our voice is really a complexity of voices from all over the state. And this Healthy Colorado initiative has focused on energy. What kind of energy are you using? And is that sustainable? And is that going to be smart as you go forward? And we see that new codes are being developed and new requirements are being implemented from the state side that'll ultimately make you have a healthier approach to how you both run your home and your business. And so we try to give people some ideas about what those mandates might be, what they currently are, and what you can do about those things. And so you can actually find a handbook called Building Change on the coloradoforum.com website, which I would encourage you to look at. And transportation, same. We've done a handbook, Driving Change. How can you be a more sustainable citizen by thinking about an electric vehicle, by using the bus or the rapid transit, or riding your bike, or whatever it is that you can do? Because it's not, despite the deniers, it's no surprise when we have the kind of climate change that we're experiencing in this country and the world. So that's one of our, and growth has exacerbated that. I'm sure you've noticed that the traffic in our metro area, I don't know how you got here this morning, but it's just always bad. And I think that, you know, as a fourth generation, whoa, I'm now really speaking, fourth generation Coloradan, you know, I have seen this change dramatically. So we have to acknowledge that this growth has an impact there. We're also interested in making sure that people can get broadband wherever they live. And because of our Durango consortia, we are focusing on the outskirts of Durango, which any of us would love to live there. I mean, it is about the most beautiful place you can imagine. If you haven't been there, you need to go. But they have no internet. And so we're trying, both with the help of the federal government and with the help of our local partners, to make sure that we can create some kind of a pilot program in that Durango area that can be implemented throughout Colorado to make sure that all the kids in the state have, including the native populations in that area, have broadband for their learning, for their health care. I mean, we're using broadband for everything. And if you don't have it and you can't use it, you are at a huge disadvantage in today's world. And we're also working, and I relate this to growth as well. We've had a lot of people move into Colorado who see the world differently than some of us do. And so we are focusing on trying to make sure that all of the misinformation and the disinformation and the malinformation, I hope you're proud of me knowing all these labels, is corrected in the factual information. And so we are using our members and their networks and CoLab, which is, I don't know if you've run into CoLab, but it's a wonderful organization of many, 180 Colorado news outlets of every type and variety, both internet and print. And we are going to put out the facts about this election in November. This is why it's safe. In fact, Colorado probably has the country's safest population, safest voting opportunity. how you do it, what your options are, what makes it easy. And everybody, we hope, will hear one way or another what those facts are. And we hope that it will counter some of the misinformation. So, excuse me, those are a couple of the things that we're working on right now. I can give you more. We're very worried about Colorado agriculture and the fact that the Colorado River is drying up. And we've been very good stewards of that river. Our lower basin states have been less good stewards, and we're trying to figure out, are there compromises? Are we going to need to encourage the lower basin states to step up and really make a difference? Is alfalfa any different growing in California than growing on our western slope? So all of those kinds of issues. Water is a big one for us as well. And I just want to end with one other that we have worked on as the Colorado Forum from day one, and that's education. Both pre-K, 12, and higher education. And we formed an organization called Building a Better Colorado. Maybe you've heard about this group. We travel around to 37 different communities. We talk to leaders. It's not y'all come, it's you. Again, if you're a superintendent of schools, if you're the banker, if you are running another kind of significant organization in your community, if you are the mayor or the county commissioner, you come to the table, and they have for the last 10 years, and talk to us about issues that we want to understand the various perspectives in Colorado about. Education was the last one that we did, and we're going to do another one on education. And we have this elegant, what we call Epiphany Committee, that is coming up with some ideas about how we really can improve our education system, K-12, in the state. So stay tuned. And if you would like to participate in one of these, what we call BBCO, Building a Better Colorado conversations, just let me know, and I'm happy to get you plugged in. So I'm going to let you go. You're standing in your.
That's
seat.
awesome, Gail. Thank you, and thanks for making those connections and for all the work the forum's been doing on these issues. If you have questions that you want to, I guess we're going to ask people to pass them to the edge and to this side, and we'll pick those up and bring those up. There's so many things we could talk about after your initial comments, and it's awesome too, I think, for setting up our subsequent monthly breakfast events and focusing on some of these issues. But I want to ask, maybe start with Jason, as you look at the subpopulation groups that Elizabeth laid out, there's at least three big issues that I see. One is our changing demographics, which is hugely important but varies across the state. Second is aging, which creates a lot of new challenge. And I think third is the urban rural, right? We saw the I-25 corridor growing fast and the rest of the state, with a few exceptions, struggling. And we know in our politics, the urban rural divide across the country is a big one. And Gail referred to disinformation, malinformation, and information generally. So maybe pick one or two of those subgroups, and what are your thoughts on where we've been and where we're going in Colorado?
Well, that's a big question, Paul. So when I saw some of that, I, like maybe many of you, immediately thought, well, what does this mean for me, for my business, for what I'm doing? And first of all, the older population is probably good for history museums, because people tend to get more interested in history after they've seen a little bit of it, or maybe after they've realized their grievous error and not studying it more when they were younger. So that's maybe encouraging news for history museums, if not for history majors. And I think the diversity and the urban-rural both seem self-evident from someone who lives in downtown Denver, that this is underway. And it's something that, again, I thought well, how is History Colorado positioning itself to recognize this? We talk about wanting to share, we talk about our shared history, our shared past at History Colorado, and making sure that everyone can see the truth of their experience in the stories that we are relating and co-authoring with communities around the state. And I think that is a challenge that we have embraced as we've recognized the need for more inclusive stories, that story that the people who were moving here in the 60s and 70s maybe were getting isn't adequate to the way we understand the world, or adequate to helping us understand the world, illuminate a path to a brighter future, maybe is the way to say that. But what really jumps out at me is, I think so much of this New West, and I don't have the stats, but maybe Elizabeth does, so much of this rise of the New West in especially the 60s and 70s was fueled by younger people, people in that 18 to 40 age range, probably, maybe even a little younger than that. And I am interested in if we are generally, as Coloradans, growing older, if that isn't a sign that, we have passed this historical era, or it is closing and a new one is rising. I don't know what that new one is, but it does feel like so much of that energy for outdoor recreation, for creating a teenage culture in Denver, because if you were a kid in Kansas or Utah who had some musical talent, where were you going to come to find a community? You were going to come to Denver. I mean, it's the biggest music scene until you get to Chicago or San Francisco, basically. And I wonder if that will start to wane as there's just not as much pull for those younger people, or maybe does an older population mean not as much pull for the younger people? That's a sort of thought that went through my mind as Elizabeth delimited those subcategories of population. I don't know, Elizabeth, did your research say? Do you have the answers?
Yeah, Elizabeth, thanks.
Again, a big question.
Yeah, many big questions.
So I do think that the aging is a huge transition for Colorado. Keep in the back of your mind that Colorado is still like the 6th youngest state. So it's not like we're all of a sudden going to be like super old. We're just going to be older, right? And that's, I think, important because it's all relative to the rest of the United States and who you're drawing and who's around. Now, aging certainly has impacted mobility because people don't move as often as they age. We don't have the largest share of our population in the age groups that migrate, which is kind of 20 to 40. And so that fundamentally just changes the pot of people that you can pick from or that would potentially move. And so I think it will, interestingly, potentially change culture a little bit because you won't have that driving change of that younger population. You're really seeing that drive at the older. And it may not drive as much of a music scene, but you'll also have to think about as people age, they also tend to have more money, even though teens had money and no responsibility.
It's that second part that's key.
Older adults also tend to have money, and interesting, definitely driving the history museums for sure. But what else? It could be more foodie, because if you look at consumer expenditure patterns, older adults spend a lot more money eating out in recreation than an average person. So that might be a component to be thinking of. But what I think about them as is that we've really got these older adults that are going to be aging out of the labor force in the largest numbers we've ever seen, that this could be a potential brain drain. but also the importance of that this is going to drive more demand for employment. Because as I age out, I'm going to need somebody to take my spot. And we're also creating more jobs in Colorado. The caveat that I'm going to toss on this is that the one thing that we are high at is expense. So we are one of the highest cost of livings in the country, about probably fourth highest if we look at all states. And that does drive change. It coincided that John Denver and our depression or recession in Colorado kind of hit at the same time, to where when he was becoming cool, our prices were falling, and it made Colorado affordable. As we're not as affordable, these other places like Texas are becoming cooler, not like temperature-wise, but price-wise. And places like Ohio, in the Midwest, are leveraging their lower costs and their historical nature and driving more of a foodies and music scene. So I think it'll be curious to see how Colorado competes in that future.
Thank you. Gail, thoughts on sub-demographics?
Well, I don't think we're going to see Colorado change dramatically in terms of its attraction to younger people. And because of really what I think you said, Jason, the demographics, I mean, I don't know what to call it, the scenery here attracts everybody. And, you know, the older population likes to go to the mountains too. They may do something different, but they're there. And everybody I talk to, and I see a lot of younger kids. We have 4 daughters, and we know a lot of these folks who say, I always dreamed of coming to Colorado, and now I'm here and I'm so happy I'm never leaving. And I see that all the time. So I don't think we can just say because we have an older population than we'd had in the past, that we're not going to have a younger population too. And it's part of the Colorado paradox. You know, we attract a lot of younger people for a myriad reasons. And I think that that's not going to change.
Thanks. And as I think Elizabeth mentioned, this obviously has implications for higher ed, and part of our CU Denver strategic plan is lifelong learning, in part because the 18-year-old has peaked, but also to legitimately hopefully serve folks in those higher age groups. There's several good questions from the audience. I'll start with one that I think is particularly interesting, and it relates to what we've been talking about. So with COVID, certainly more people were working remotely, but even before COVID, there were some trends in that direction. And so for Colorado, both internally, I mean, one possibility could be that people live in or decide to move to some of these rural communities that are losing population, but might be more affordable, and do their work from there if they can. Or it might be nationally, people might want to enjoy the amenities and scenery of Colorado for a job that's based in New York if they can do it remotely. How do you see that playing out? I know it's very speculative, but I think a lot of people are fascinated by that. And maybe we'll start with Gail on this.
I think that is a big change in what we've seen, post-COVID. And I wish we were post-COVID, but with COVID, I mean, from our perspective, we're not in the office every day. I don't know many who are, unless they're, in the restaurant business or where you have to have a personal contact every day. And I think it's healthy. I think it's really allowed people to have better balance in their lives. So I'm seeing that as a permanent change in how in this country, maybe in the world, we're beginning to have a different relationship with our workplace. And I think we're seeing it in how buildings are moving from office spaces to housing spaces, or a combination of the two. You see it, big time in Denver. There are all these buildings that were office buildings are getting bought by individuals and companies that want to turn them into housing units. So that's a big one.
Jason, your thoughts on that?
Sure. So first of all, I appreciate working at home 1 or 2 days a week for sure, just like everyone else. When they gave me a history degree, they did not give me a crystal ball, which I lament. And so I don't know where this is headed, but I am skeptical that is the permanent shift that maybe we all are hoping right now. I think what I originally expected is that we would see this sort of second wave of New West energy as people were completely decoupled from needing to be where their jobs were, and that we might see some redistribution to some of the places that were growing at a slower rate and had lower prices. And I think we have, to some extent. The prices in Leadville have shot up so that it's now unaffordable too. But it didn't redistribute to the places that I thought it might, like the Eastern Plains, like the Western Slope, some of the beautiful spots. We didn't see in Colorado a big decampment from those urban centers to other places. We may have seen more in-migration in some ways from second homeowners who moved to Crested Butte or someplace, but we, at least, and Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like the folks who were decamping from places like the Bay Area were either moving to the places that were already very popular here in Colorado, or were moving elsewhere. But we didn't see that redistribution. And so I think because of that, I am a little skeptical that the shift is going to be very significant or long lasting. I think we will revert to patterns that we're all familiar with over time, is my prediction.
So I just want to make a distinction between moving someplace remote or deciding that you're going to live in Colorado and work in New York remotely, and working at home, wherever you are, which is, not so far from your office. So I think we need to see these things as two different opportunities. Maybe you go on vacation and you take your computer with you and you have a link back to your office. But mostly I think people have made a decision about where they want to be. And I agree with you, Jason. I don't think it's going to mean that people will move necessarily to Scottsdale or to Austin, but I think they will work from home on a regular basis.
Great. Thanks. Elizabeth, on this one?
Yeah, so I'm kind of in the middle between the two. What we know is that only about 25% of jobs can be done remotely. A lot of times we think that everybody's like ourselves. And so if you all work remotely, it's maybe because you're also hanging out with a lot of people that can do jobs that can be remote. But there are so many people that can't work remotely. So that's, I think, the first understanding. And there's a great breakdown that you can get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics by industry to know which ones are remote-able and which ones aren't. I also agree that the perspective or the perspective on that remote-able is, like, for me, Colorado, yes, I can work from home, but I have to live in the state of Colorado to do my job. State of Colorado doesn't allow somebody to be living out of state to hold this job. But that's not the same for all places. Like, I know Jefferson County was looking at their policies because they couldn't attract enough workers for Jeffco jobs on whether or not they would allow people to live out of state and hold that job for Jeffco. And so I think you're going to see some positions make those choices. I also think that it's a double-edged sword for some of our remote areas. in some cases so positive, right? Because for them to attract a worker, it was hard if they were a couple, because maybe there was job for one person, but there wasn't job for both partners. And so this allows that person to get a job, let's say in Sterling, but their partner then has a job maybe in Denver. And they can do that, maybe commute once a week or twice a month, whatever it might be. The negative side of that is that Sterling may have been able to attract that one worker to have a job in Sterling, but let's say now both partners have a job in Denver. They live in Sterling, but they're taking that job from Denver, making maybe more money than that Sterling paid job. And now Sterling still can't find a worker. So it goes on both ends. And I agree. I think we are still going to wait and see how it turns out. I have a feeling we've seen the trend line that it is declining with time, the number that of people that are working remotely. And I think we have to think about the kiddos. Young adults still like each other, right? And they want to see each other. They want to be in the office. I've got 2 launchers right now, and neither one of them want to take jobs that are remote. They want an office and they want to hang out with people. They want to learn from colleagues, and they can only do that if we're in the office with them. So I think we're going to learn a lot over the next several years.
Great. Well, those are fantastic perspectives. I really appreciate it. We're up against time, and I know Elizabeth also needs to run, and we still have some food in back. And thank you to our audience. Thank you to our 20 or so folks that were online. But most importantly, thank you so much for our panelists, and please join me in thanking them.